The millionaire's twin daughters lived surrounded by luxury, but trapped in darkness, until the humble nanny made them see the world, not with their eyes, but with their hearts. The crunch of gravel under Richard's Italian leather shoes was the only sound that broke the afternoon's silence. He had returned from Zurich 2 days ahead of schedule, a rare change of plans driven by an exhaustion that not even the successful multi-million-dollar deal in euros had managed to soothe. He passed through the wrought iron gates, a monument to his fortune, and chose the long path to the main entrance, skirting the edge of a garden that was the landscape architect's pride, but to him was nothing more than a static set piece, a composition of greens and colors his daughters would never see. The mansion, with its imposing architecture and windows like vacant eyes, rose like a mausoleum to his own wealth, a place where the echo of footsteps was more present than the sound of voices. That's when he heard it. A sound so strange and out of place in that controlled environment that it made him stop short, his heart pounding with a mix of curiosity and alarm. It was laughter, not restrained, polite chuckles, but full, musical, childish laughter that seemed to spring from the earth itself. He followed the forgotten melody, rounding a perfectly trimmed boxwood hedge, and the scene that unfolded before him left him breathless. There, kneeling in the aromatic herb garden, were Lara and Lily, his 7-year-old twins, blind since birth. Their small hands, which he was accustomed to seeing always immaculate, were covered in dirt, and with them, equally smudged and with a serene smile on her face, was the new nanny, Helena. He had hired her less than a month ago, a gamble based more on desperation than conviction after a succession of professionals who had treated his daughters like porcelain dolls. Helena was holding a sprig of rosemary near Lily's nose. "Smell that. It has a sharp little scent, like a tight hug." "That's rosemary," she was saying, her voice as soft as rose petals. Lara, beside her, gently ran her fingers over a stalk of lavender. "And this one, with the little beads on top, has a sleepy smell, like a purple dream." "That's lavender." The girls laughed. A pure sound Richard hadn't heard in so many months, he'd almost forgotten what it was like. The pain of their mother's absence had silenced the house, and he, in his inability to deal with his own grief, had filled the void with rules, silence, and the latest accessibility technology, turning their home into an efficient but soulless museum. The shock that paralyzed him wasn't the dirt on their expensive dresses or the breach of protocol, it was the sound. That laughter was an asset his entire net worth, his stock market investments, and his multi-million-dollar businesses could not buy. It was a dividend of pure joy, an emotional profit he didn't know how to calculate. Helena, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, looked up and saw him. Her smile vanished instantly, her body stiffened, and her serenity gave way to visible apprehension. She expected the reprimand, the dismissal. She knew she had crossed a line, desecrated the sterile sanctuary with the mess of real life. Richard opened his mouth to say something, perhaps to question, to order them back inside, but no words came out. The world, with all its complexity and noise, suddenly seemed to fall silent, forcing him to just watch. The entire house, with its polished corridors, its tall windows, and the grand piano that collected dust and locked away memories, seemed to hold its breath along with him. In that instant, the fate of the 4 of them, the father who had built a fortress, the daughters trapped within it, and the woman who dared to plant a flower in a crack in the wall, began to take shape. He remained there, mute, like a man who, after a lifetime of accumulating an immense fortune, had come face to face with a kind of wealth he didn't know he possessed, feeling the weight of the silence he himself had imposed. The silence that settled over the garden was heavier than any shout. Richard finally moved, not toward them, but toward the house, his steps sounding deliberately controlled. He didn't say a word, didn't cast a single look of disapproval, and for Helena, this absence of reaction was more terrifying than the harshest scolding. She felt her blood run cold, the certainty of her dismissal forming a knot in her throat. She helped the girls to their feet, wiping the dirt from their hands with a gentleness that hid the tremor in her own. "Let's go inside, my flowers. Time to wash up for a snack," she said, her voice a wavering thread. The moment she crossed the threshold into the kitchen, she came face to face with the housekeeper, Mrs. Peterson, a woman of impeccable posture and a gaze that could scan for infractions. "Mr. Sterling has returned, and he did not seem at all pleased with what he saw in the garden," Mrs. Peterson pronounced, her words as dry as autumn leaves. "The rules are clear, Helena. The girls have schedules and planned activities. The garden is not a playground." Helena just nodded, her heart tight in her chest. She carried the scar of a previous dismissal, where she had been accused of getting too involved, of confusing her role. She had sworn to herself she would maintain a professional distance, that she would treat this job like a business, an investment of her time for a salary. But Lara and Lily weren't cash flow spreadsheets. They were souls thirsty for a world that had been denied to them. That night, after the girls fell asleep to the sound of a story she made up about stars that could sing, Helena couldn't sleep. She sat at the small desk in her room and remembered her own childhood. There was no wealth, no luxury goods, but a dirt backyard where her grandmother had taught her that the universe smelled of freshly brewed coffee and sounded like the song of a robin. She had observed in the last few weeks how Lara and Lily reacted to stimuli that went unnoticed by everyone else. They knew when someone approached by the subtle creak of a floorboard. They would tilt their heads toward the patio window at exactly 10 in the morning, and Helena finally understood. They didn't see the light, but they felt the warmth of the strong sun on their faces, an invisible beacon guiding them. Vibrations were their compass. A timid but persistent courage bloomed in her chest, overpowering the fear. She couldn't back down. This wasn't just a job. It was a silent promise she had made to herself when she saw the loneliness in those two small faces. She began to write, not a letter of apology, but a plan, a sensory map for the mansion. Meanwhile, a few hallways away, Richard was locked in his study, a sanctuary of mahogany and leather where he commanded his empire. He stared at his computer screen, at the graphs showing the profitability of his investments, the growth of his capital, and his stock prices. But the images in his mind were different. His daughter's hands, dirty with earth, the sound of their laughter echoing among the rose bushes. He had always measured success in numbers, in net worth. But what was all of it worth if the house remained silent? The memory of his late wife, Beatrice, ambushed him. She had always argued that the girls needed the world, not a bubble. But after she was gone, fear consumed him. Fear of failing them, fear that the world would hurt them. Hope was a high-risk investment, and he had already lost too much. Helena's proposal, with its dangerous simplicity, felt like an invitation to go all in again, and he was terrified. The sound of a soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. The door opened and Helena appeared, pale but with steady eyes, holding a few sheets of paper. She stopped before his massive desk, the chasm of power and money between them, and held the papers out to him. Richard took the pages with the reluctance of a man receiving a loss report. His hands, accustomed to handling contracts that moved enormous capital and analyzing the returns of investment funds, felt the simple texture of the printer paper, the residual warmth from Helena's hands. He read in silence, his expression unreadable. The sensory map was disarmingly simple. Wind chimes with different tones for each doorway. Yarn threads with wooden and ceramic beads to guide the way through the corridors. Rugs of varied textures, sisal for the path to the garden, velvet for the entrance to the music room. There were no proposals for expensive treatments. No mention of cutting-edge technology. It was a plan made of sound, scent, and touch. It was a plan made of the world. When he finished reading, he looked up, and for the first time, Helena saw beyond the armor of the multi-millionaire. She saw a flicker of pain, of a profound weariness. "What do you expect to achieve with this?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I'm not promising a cure, Mr. Sterling," Helena replied, her voice firming. "Cure is a word for doctors. I'm talking about living. They already see with their ears, with their skin. I just want to give them an alphabet for the language they already speak." He leaned back in his leather chair, which creaked under the weight of his hesitation. Every specialist he'd hired, every imported piece of equipment, were assets on his personal balance sheet of fatherhood. Investments that so far had yielded no dividends of happiness. Helena's proposal was different. It didn't demand money, but something far more valuable and risky: trust. This could create false hope, he said, more to himself than to her. What if it doesn't work? What if they get frustrated? The study door opened before Helena could answer. It was Dr. Shaw, the physician who oversaw the twins' care, young, ambitious, and with the confidence of someone who believes science holds all the answers. He walked in with a tablet in hand. "Richard, forgive the hour, but I just received the latest reports from Geneva. We need to talk." He stopped when he noticed Helena, his gaze sweeping over her with professional indifference before settling on the papers on Richard's desk. "What's this?" he asked, his tone bordering on dismissive. Richard, almost relieved by the interruption, by the return to the familiar terrain of medicine and logic, handed him the plan. "Doctor." Shaw scanned the pages quickly, a skeptical smile forming on his lips. "With all due respect, Richard, this is folklore, random, uncontrolled stimuli. We need the opposite, a completely controlled environment to prepare them." He turned to his tablet screen. "That's what I came to talk about. There's a new experimental surgery. A team in Switzerland has had promising results. The chances are slim and the cost is substantial, even for you. But it's our best bet. A real bet, based on data, not wind chimes." The word data resonated with Richard. It was his native language. The doctor spoke of probabilities, of technology, of a solution that money, his most powerful tool, could buy. Helena's simplicity, which moments before had seemed like a breath of fresh air, now sounded naive, dangerously amateurish. He looked at Helena, whose face had lost all color, and then at the doctor, who represented the promise of a definitive solution, an end to the suffering. The hope Helena offered was messy and covered in dirt. The doctor's was clean, clinical, and expensive. Richard made his decision, taking refuge in the safety of logic and control. "Helena," he said, his voice once again firm, coated with the authority of the man who commanded businesses and fortunes, "I appreciate your initiative, but for now we are suspending all of this. Doctor, Shaw is right. The last thing we need right now is improvisation." The word improvisation hung in the air like a death sentence. For Helena, it was as if a steel door had slammed shut, locking away the small beam of light she had tried to bring into the darkness of that house. She didn't argue, she just nodded, gathered her papers, which now seemed foolish and childish, and left the study without another word. Defeat had a bitter taste, but beneath it, a current of stubbornness began to flow. The rules could lock her out of the hallways, but the kitchen was still her territory, a laboratory of smells and tastes that no order could sterilize. The next day, while Mrs. Peterson supervised the polishing of the silverware with surgical precision, Helena prepared the girls' milk. Instead of simply warming it, she added a dash of cinnamon. The warm, sweet aroma spread slowly through the air, an invisible and inviting trail. Minutes later, Lara and Lily entered the kitchen, following the scent as if it were Ariadne's thread. "What's that Christmas smell?" Lara asked, her little nose twitching with curiosity. Helena smiled. It's cinnamon. Do you want to learn how to crack eggs for the corn muffins? She placed an egg in each of their hands. The trick is to feel its music. Tap it gently on the side of the bowl. You'll hear a tiny little click. That's the signal. Lily's first egg splattered on the floor, and the girl flinched, expecting to be scolded. Instead, Helena laughed softly. No problem. The floor was hungry too. Try again. The sound of the second shell cracking, followed by the plop of the yolk into the bowl, was a small victory, a miniature symphony. They weren't building a map, but they were reading the world with their fingertips and their sense of smell. A small sensory transgression that flew under the housekeeper's radar. Meanwhile, Richard dove headfirst into the travel preparations. The relief of having a concrete, measurable plan of action was palpable. He spent hours in video conferences with the Swiss clinic, discussing wire transfers in euros, the logistics of their transport, the reservation of an entire hospital wing. He treated the surgery like one of his biggest business deals, a high-risk application with a potentially infinite return. His daughter's health had become another asset to be managed, and he would use his entire fortune to guarantee the best possible outcome. Allocating funds and mobilizing resources with the same efficiency he used to double his capital. It was on one of those afternoons, while analyzing his company's cash flow, that his image consultant, Veronica, entered his study. She was the personification of corporate efficiency, slender, dressed in a perfectly tailored pantsuit, and carrying a tablet that was an extension of her arm. Richard, darling, we need to talk about the new product line launch. The narrative is everything. And I have an idea that will generate an incalculable brand asset. She swiped a presentation onto the screen. The title was Overcoming and Legacy, The Richard Sterling Journey. The images showed photos of him, imposing with taglines about resilience. The market loves a personal story, and yours is pure gold. The multimillionaire, widowed father who dedicates his life to his special needs daughters. Richard felt a pang of discomfort. Veronica, I don't want to expose the girls. It's not exposure, it's inspiration, she countered, a gleam in her eye. We'll do a beautiful photo shoot. You at the piano, with them beside you, listening. An image of strength, of a father who moves the world for them. It will humanize your brand, connect with people. Think of it as an investment in your legacy, not just your financial one. Outside in the hallway, Helena had come to get a braille book and stopped when she heard the voices. She listened to the proposal, to Veronica's tone turning the children's pain into a marketing tool, and felt her stomach churn. The idea of turning Lara and Lily's story into an advertising campaign left Helena feeling nauseous. It was the antithesis of everything she believed in. Their pain was not a product. Their overcoming was not a slogan. That night, her frustration turned into a bold decision, a quiet rebellion against the emotional sterility of the mansion. Her contract was clear. Unauthorized outings were strictly forbidden. But some rules, she decided, were made to be broken when humanity was at stake. The next morning, a Saturday with mild sun and a breeze that carried the scent of fresh bread from the town bakery, she dressed the girls in their most comfortable dresses. Today, she announced in a conspiratorial whisper, we're going on a secret expedition. We're going to a place where the whole world gathers to talk with its nose and mouth. Their small faces lit up with a curiosity that overcame any fear of the unknown. Bypassing Mrs. Peterson's surveillance and taking advantage of Richard being on an online meeting about crypto prices, she led them out the back door, called a rideshare, and set off for the town's farmers' market. The impact was immediate and overwhelming. For the twins, who lived in a world of filtered sounds and controlled textures, the market was a sensory explosion. The clamor of the stalls, the overlapping voices of vendors hawking their goods, the sharp, crackling sound of donuts hitting hot oil. Helena guided them securely, turning the chaos into an adventure. "Do you smell that strong, slightly spicy scent? That's fresh cilantro," she said, picking up a bunch for them to touch. "And that rattling sound? Those are the seeds inside a passion fruit." She bought a pint of blueberries. "This one is round and smooth. When you bite it, the skin makes a little popping sound and the juice bursts in your mouth. It's sweet and a little tart." Lara and Lily were ecstatic, their small hands touching everything, their ears catching every nuance of the urban symphony, their noses deciphering a new dictionary of aromas. It was the happiest moment of their lives. But their happiness did not go unnoticed. The town was small, and the presence of the late tycoon Arthur Sterling's granddaughters, near mythical figures rarely seen outside the mansion walls, was an event. A neighbor, who knew the family's driver and found it strange not to see him around, recognized the girls. Moved by a mixture of surprise and delight, he took out his phone and discreetly started filming. He captured the exact moment Helena offered a mint leaf to Lily, who, after smelling and tasting it, declared with the seriousness of a sommelier, "This one has a blue taste, a cold blue that tickles your tongue." The poetic simplicity of that description, the genuine joy on the children's faces, and the tenderness with which the nanny guided them, created a scene of rare beauty. The man posted the video on his social media with a simple caption, "Sometimes you have to learn to see with your heart." Today at our farmers market, it didn't even take an hour. The video, boosted by the algorithm and the raw emotion it conveyed, began to spread, first to friends, then to friends of friends. By late afternoon, when Helena and the girls returned to the mansion, exhausted and happy, the video already had thousands of views. The small, secret expedition, the attempt to give the girls a taste of the world, had gone viral, turning an intimate moment of discovery into a public spectacle. And the storm brewing on the digital horizon was about to break over the silent walls of that house. The video didn't reach Richard like a gentle breeze, but like a hurricane. It was Veronica who brought it, storming into his study without knocking, her face a mask of controlled fury, the tablet held out like a weapon. "We have a crisis, Richard. A brand crisis with the potential to become an incalculable liability." She hit play, and the scene from the farmer's market filled the screen. For a second, the sound of his daughter's laughter, the poetic description of the mint's blue taste, pierced Richard's armor. He saw the same pure joy he had witnessed in the garden, but now it was exposed, vulnerable, served up for the judgment of thousands of strangers. Before the feeling could deepen, the door opened again, and Dr. Shaw entered, his expression equally grim. He had been alerted by a colleague who saw the video. "Richard, this is a disaster," he said, his voice sharp. "I warned you about uncontrolled stimuli. How am I supposed to present a stable clinical profile to the team in Switzerland now? This irresponsible field trip could have compromised months of observation. The ROI on our investment of time and hope is at risk." The gratitude Richard had felt for a brief moment was buried under the pressure. Veronica spoke of losing control of the narrative, of how the story she had planned as a golden asset for the brand now seemed cheap, sentimental, and out of her command. The doctor spoke of risks, of compromised data, of endangering the real solution. Both of them, his trusted advisors, the architects of his controlled world, pointed to the same culprit, Helena. The anger that seized Richard wasn't pure. It was a complex amalgam of fear, humiliation, and a terrible sense of powerlessness. He, the man who controlled a multi-billion-dollar fortune, who moved markets with a single decision, could not control the narrative inside his own home. Dinner that night was a funereal ceremony. The silence was so thick that the clinking of silverware on china sounded like small aggressions. Lara and Lily, sensing the emotional storm in the air, barely touched their food, their small bodies hunched in their chairs. Richard waited until the plates were cleared. Then he fixed his gaze on Helena, his voice as cold as the marble floor. "You had no right," he began, each word a falling stone. "You violated a contract, but more than that, you violated my trust. You exposed my daughters in a reckless and selfish way. You used them." Helena met his gaze, her face pale but her eyes steady. "I didn't use them. I took them to feel the world, because they are a part of it," she answered, her voice low but unwavering. "You talk about investments and deals, but their childhood is not an asset to be locked in a safe. It's a life that needs to be lived." Her defiant calm only fueled his fury. "Enough! You are forbidden from taking any initiative that is not expressly on the schedule. None, or the front door will be your only route." The girls, hearing their father's harsh tone, began to cry softly, a stifled, frightened sound. The house, which for a brief period had learned to breathe, plunged back into the darkness of silence and fear. From the dining room doorway, observing it all, Mrs. Peterson felt something break inside her. Her loyalty to her employer's rules warred with the image of the girls, joy at the market, and the pain she saw now. Later, when the house was steeped in the quiet of the night, she went to the linen closet. Behind a stack of old linen towels was a wooden box. With trembling hands, she opened it and took out a bundle of yellowed envelopes, tied with a faded satin ribbon. The days following the reprimand were grey and heavy. The mansion reverted to being a mausoleum, with silence as the guardian of its halls. Helena performed her duties with robotic precision, an automaton programmed to follow meal times and braille reading sessions. Lara and Lily's laughter had vanished, replaced by a frightened stillness. They sensed the tension, their father's disapproval, and retreated into their shells like startled snails. Helena felt like an investor who had wagered all her emotional capital on stocks that had turned to dust overnight. The return on her effort was zero, a loss that hurt the soul more than the wallet. She looked at the high walls, at the expensive furniture that was just part of a rich man's estate, and felt suffocated. The idea of leaving, of finding a place where life wasn't a liability to be controlled, began to form like a storm cloud in her mind. She couldn't fight a fortune, the power of a billionaire who saw the world through spreadsheets of profit and risk. That night, a light rain tapped against her bedroom window, a melancholy drumming that matched her thoughts. She was sitting on her bed, her employment contract on her lap, rereading the clauses that now felt like golden chains, when she heard a nearly imperceptible knock on her door. It was so soft, she thought it was the wind, but the knock came again. Hesitant, she opened the door to find Mrs. Peterson. The housekeeper, always so upright and impenetrable, seemed smaller, her shoulders slightly stooped, her face lined with an emotion Helena couldn't identify. In her hands, she held a small, dark wooden box. "May I come in?" Mrs. Peterson asked, her voice a whisper. Helena stepped aside, surprise overcoming her mistrust. Mrs. Peterson entered and, without preamble, placed the box on the bed. "I shouldn't be doing this," she said, wringing her hands in her apron. "This goes against everything Mr. Sterling has ordered. But the silence in this house, it's wrong. It's gone wrong again." She opened the box. Inside, tied with a satin ribbon that had once been blue, was a bundle of envelopes. "They're from Mrs. Beatrice, their mother," Mrs. Peterson confessed, her voice choked with emotion. "She made me promise I would give them to their father if he ever lost his way. I hid them, out of fear, out of a foolish loyalty to the rules. But the true inheritance she wanted to leave isn't in the family trust. It's here." She pushed the box toward Helena and left the room as quietly as she had entered, leaving behind the scent of lavender and a time bomb of paper and ink. With her heart hammering against her ribs, Helena picked up the first envelope. The handwriting was elegant, fluid, but with a slight tremor that betrayed the writer's weakness. She began to read. They were pleas, instructions from a mother who knew she would not see her daughters grow up. "Do not isolate them from the world in the name of protection," one letter read. Teach them to see with their whole bodies. The red of a cherry is in the bite on the tongue. The yellow of the sun is in the warmth on the skin. The sound of the piano is the color of longing. Let them get their hands dirty. The words were a perfect echo of her own soul, a mirror of everything she had tried to do. As her eyes moved across the lines, a strange feeling began to take hold. That handwriting, she knew it. The way the letter B curled, the firm stroke of the R. The memory came like a flash of lightning, transporting her back years, to the quiet corridor of a public hospital where she was doing her internship as a nursing assistant. A patient in room 302, young, with eyes full of a luminous sadness, who spent her hours writing in a journal. A patient who spoke with a desperate longing for her newborn twin daughters she had barely been able to hold. Helena, the 19-year-old intern, would bring her tea and listen. In the silence of one pre-dawn morning, as the rain beat against the hospital window, the young woman had made a final request of her. "If you ever can, promise me you'll help someone feel the world in a way I couldn't." The realization hit her with a devastating impact, knocking the wind out of her. The woman in the hospital was Beatrice. The forgotten promise, made in a moment of youthful compassion, had traveled through time and fate to find her here, in this room, in this house. She hadn't just gotten a job, she had been called to fulfill an oath. The revelation of the letters was like a lightning strike that doesn't destroy, but illuminates. Helena spent the night awake, not with the anxiety of uncertainty, but with the overwhelming clarity of purpose. The promise made to that young mother on her hospital bed was no longer a dusty memory, but a mandate, a moral compass that redefined her place in that house. The fear of being fired, the intimidation in the face of Richard's fortune, all of it dissolved. She was no longer just an employee. She was the guardian of an emotional last will, the executor of an inheritance that could not be measured in dollars or gold. In the morning, when she prepared the girls' breakfast, her gestures had a new solemnity. She was no longer breaking rules out of stubbornness. She was honoring a final wish. This newfound sense of purpose armed her with a serene and unshakable courage. The invitation arrived in Richard's email, but a copy was sent for the nanny's attention. It was from the special school the girls attended twice a week. The principal was inviting them to play a prominent role in the community's annual summer fair, to narrate over the microphone how they imagined the colors of the festive banners and the traditional foods. Helena read the email and felt destiny smiling upon her. It was the perfect opportunity, a stage for the girls' inner poetry to be heard. She waited for Richard to return from his morning run and approached him at the kitchen entrance, the tablet with the invitation in her hands. "Mr. Sterling, the school sent an invitation for the girls." He took the device, his eyes scanning the text quickly. The mention of public and microphone made him stiffen instantly. "Absolutely not," he said, his voice categorical. "We've had enough public exposure." "But this is different," Helena argued, her voice calm but firm. "It's a safe environment with the school. It's a chance for them to express themselves, to share their world." "Their world," he retorted, his sarcasm sharp, "is about to change with a procedure that requires extremely high capital and a controlled environment. The return on that investment depends on minimizing variables. A summer fair is the opposite of that. End of discussion." He turned to leave, but Helena didn't back down. Their mother wouldn't have wanted this. The sentence hit him like a punch. He turned back slowly, his eyes narrowed. "Don't you dare speak about my wife." "I dare," she said, her heart pounding, but her voice not trembling. "I dare because she would have preferred the sound of her daughters' voices on a microphone to the silence of an operating room. She would have wanted their wealth to be measured in experiences, not just in the assets you can buy, Richard was speechless, shocked by her audacity. The mention of Beatrice disarmed him, tearing open a wound he kept carefully closed. He left her in the kitchen, anger and pain warring within him, and took refuge in the music room, the only room he had kept exactly as Beatrice had left it. The grand piano, closed for years, was the largest and most silent of all the ghosts. He remembered her playing Chopin sonatas, the music filling every corner of the house, a time when the cash flow of his emotional life was positive. Driven by an impulse he didn't understand, a desperate desire to connect with something he had lost, he sat down at the bench. He lifted the heavy lid, revealing the keys, yellowed by time. His fingers, accustomed to computer keyboards that commanded international businesses, hesitated. Then he pressed a single key, a hesitant middle C, which came out muffled and slightly out of tune from disuse. The solitary, imperfect sound hung in the air, heavy with the weight of years of silence. Upstairs, in their room, Lara and Lily, who were playing with building blocks, suddenly stopped. They felt the subtle vibration that traveled up through the house's frame, an unknown wave in the ocean of silence they were used to. And then, in unison, they did something that left their father paralyzed. They began to clap, completely off rhythm, a clumsy and pure applause for the single note of music their house had produced in years. The sound of that clumsy clapping echoed in the music room with the force of a symphony. Richard was frozen, his fingers still hovering over the C key. It wasn't applause for a performance, but a pure, instinctive response to a vibration, a recognition that something in the silent universe of the house had changed. That sound was an unexpected dividend, a profit that none of his stocks on the exchange could ever yield. It was the audible proof of what Helena had been saying. They could already see, in a way that he, with all his vision, had never been able to comprehend. He stood up slowly, his heart racing, and walked up the stairs, following the echo of that applause. He stopped at the doorway of their room and watched them. They had gone back to playing with their blocks, but there was a subtle smile on their lips, a remnant of contentment that transformed the room's atmosphere. For the first time in a long time, he didn't see them as a problem to be solved, a liability on his emotional balance sheet, but as a treasure whose value he was only beginning to discover. Richard's hesitation, however, was fertile ground for external pressures. The next day, Dr. Shaw and Veronica cornered him in his study, a coordinated offensive to bring him back to reality. "Richard, the clinic needs the final confirmation and the wire transfer of the euros by tomorrow," the doctor said, his tone urgent. "Any delay could cause us to lose our slot. This is the most important investment of your life. We can't risk its ROI for sentimentality." Veronica followed up, showing graphs on her tablet. "And from a brand perspective, we need to act. The video went viral, but we can spin this. The narrative of the surgery abroad, the father who moves heaven and earth for his daughter's cure, that's powerful. That sells Richard. It's a brand legacy worth its weight in gold." Their words were logical, calculated. They spoke the language he understood: investment, ROI, profit, gold. But the out-of-tune melody of his daughter's clapping resonated in his mind, a note of truth that was dissonant with all their corporate speak. Meanwhile, news of the video and the commotion in the small town traveled in digital waves, reaching unexpected places. It arrived on the screen of Isabella, Richard's ex-fiancée. Chic, sophisticated, and pragmatic, Isabella saw the world as a series of strategic transactions. The end of her engagement to Richard had been, in her terms, a bad deal, a loss of access to considerable wealth and status. She watched the farmer's market video not with emotion, but with the eye of a market analyst. She saw Richard's vulnerability, the disorder invading his controlled empire. She saw an opportunity to reopen a negotiation she had considered closed. With a calculated smile, she dialed a number. "Darling, I need a favor." she said to an influential friend in the media. "It seems Richard is in need of some help putting his house in order. I think it's time to remind him what it's like to have a woman with a firm hand by his side." The pressure on Richard was about to multiply, coming from a front he hadn't anticipated. He felt trapped between two kinds of capital, the financial, which promised a clinical solution, and the emotional, which offered an uncertain and terrifying joy. The decision about the summer fair and the surgery had become the tipping point of his life. Late in the afternoon, exhausted by the internal battle, he sat at his desk, the contract from the Swiss clinic in front of him. The pen in his hand felt like it weighed a ton. He just had to sign, authorize the final transfer, and the path would be set. Dr. Shaw waited on a video call, his expectant face on the screen. "I have the document here," Richard said, his voice hoarse. He placed the tip of the pen on the dotted line, his daughter's fate a single stroke away. At that exact moment, the intercom on his desk crackled, breaking the tension. Mrs. Peterson's voice came through, filled with a restrained urgency. "Mr. Sterling, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Miss Isabella is at the gate and she insists on coming in." Isabella's arrival was like introducing a volatile variable into a delicate financial equation. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. Isabella wasn't just an ex-fiancée. She represented order, discipline, and a worldview where children should be seen and preferably not heard, especially if they were different. She was the personification of the life he had led before Helena's arrival, a life of impeccable appearances and carefully managed emotions. "Let her in," he told Mrs. Peterson, resignation heavy in his voice. He ended the call with Dr. Shaw, asking for 1 more hour to finalize the signature. Isabella's presence was a problem he needed to solve first. She swept into his study as if she had never left, her expensive perfume filling the air, her eyes appraising every object, every speck of dust that might have settled in her absence. "Richard, darling," she said, her voice soft but with a steel edge. "I saw the video. I was so concerned. Your daughter's exposed like that. It's a failure of management, of control. This is why things didn't work out between us. You let yourself get carried away by sentimental impulses." She walked to the window, looking out at the garden where it all began. "This nanny, it's clear she lacks the necessary structure. Children like yours need routine, firmness, not anarchic trips to the farmer's market. If you would allow me," she turned, her eyes locking onto his, "I could assume their guardianship, with the proper discipline. With my network, we could prepare them appropriately for the future your wealth can provide." The word guardianship hit Richard like a blow. Isabella wasn't offering help. She was proposing a hostile takeover of his family. She saw his daughters as mismanaged assets that, under her administration, could have their market value raised. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a process server. A man in a grey suit, a folder in hand, asked to speak with Richard privately. It turned out Isabella's concern had already translated into action. She and Dr. Shaw, joining forces for the well-being of the children, had filed an emergency petition, advised by expensive lawyers, to establish visitation limits and accelerate the decision on the surgery, arguing that the nanny's destabilizing influence put the treatment at risk. A hearing was set for the following week. Richard's world collapsed. He was being sued, not by a business rival, but by his doctor and his ex-fiancée. The battle for his daughter's souls had become a legal dispute, complete with lawyers and petitions. The cash flow of his patience and emotional strength was in the red. Helena, learning the news from a livid Mrs. Peterson, felt the floor drop out from under her. She had never imagined her act of love could be twisted into a legal weapon against her and, worse, against the girl's own father. The fear she had felt at the beginning returned, but it was different now. It was a cold fear, the fear of losing not a job, but two children who had nestled into her heart. That night, the mansion was a silent battlefield. Richard, locked in his study, surrounded by his own lawyers, analyzed the situation like a business deal gone terribly wrong, an investment that had resulted in a massive liability. Helena, in her room, read and reread Beatrice's letters, searching them for the strength for the fight to come. The mother's words felt like a whisper of encouragement from the past, and the twins, oblivious to the war being waged in their name, were asleep. In the middle of the night, Lily had a nightmare and woke up calling, not for her father, but for Helena. Helena ran to their room and soothed her, singing a soft lullaby her grandmother had taught her. Lara, waking up, reached out her hand in the dark and held on to hers. "Don't go, Lena," she whispered. "The piano will be sad again." In that touch, in that simple sentence, Helena found her resolve. She wasn't going anywhere. This was no longer a matter of a contract. It was a promise, and she would fight for it, no matter how many billions her opponent had or how expensive his lawyers were. The legal war turned the mansion into a command center. Lawyers in expensive suits came and went, transforming the dining room into a crisis room, covering the mahogany table with stacks of documents that tried to translate love and pedagogy into the cold jargon of the law. Richard, for the first time in his life, felt that his vast financial resources were insufficient. He could hire the best team, allocate unlimited funds to his defense. But how do you quantify the value of a laugh? How do you present the blue taste of mint as evidence in court? He found himself analyzing the case like one of his most complex business deals, a high-risk investment where the assets at stake weren't measured in stocks or crypto, but in the future of his daughters. His lawyers were pragmatic. "They'll argue the nanny is an unstable influence and that you've been negligent. They'll use the video against us. Paint a picture of irresponsibility that jeopardizes a cutting-edge medical treatment." On the eve of the hearing, the house was steeped in a tense stillness. The girls, sensing the anxiety radiating from the adults, were quieter than usual, clinging to Helena as if she were an anchor in a stormy sea. After she put them to bed, Helena went downstairs and found Richard in the music room, standing beside the closed piano, staring into space. The moonlight coming through the tall window cast a silver rectangle on the floor, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. "They're going to take them away from me, aren't they?" she asked, her voice little more than a breath. He turned, and in the dim light, the billionaire's mask had fallen away. All that was left was a terrified father. "They're going to try," he answered. "They'll say I'm an absent father who outsourced affection and that you're an adventurer. They'll use my money against me, as if every investment I made for their safety is proof that I don't know how to love them." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of exhaustion. "And the truth is, maybe they aren't entirely wrong. I don't know how to love without a plan, without a guaranteed return. I see a problem and I try to buy the solution. Beatrice, she knew how to feel. I only know how to calculate." It was the rawest confession he had ever made. Helena drew closer, her heart aching for him, for herself, for all of them. "You're not alone in this," she said, and for the first time, she used a word that redefined their relationship. "We're not alone." She held out her hand, not to touch him, but to show him what she was holding, the bundle of Beatrice's letters tied with the faded ribbon. "I think the best lawyer we have can't be in court tomorrow." But she left her testimony. Richard took the envelopes, his hands trembling. He recognized the handwriting instantly. He sat down on the piano bench and, in the moonlight, began to read his wife's words. Every sentence was a bridge between the past and the present, a validation of Helena's every instinct, an absolution for every act of improvisation. They were love letters, not just to him, but to a future she would not see, an instruction manual for the souls of his daughters. When he finished the last letter, a single tear traced a path down his cheek and fell onto the yellowed paper. He looked up at Helena, gratitude and pain mingling in his eyes. In that moment, they were no longer employer and employee. They were accomplices, united by an inheritance of love and the promise to fight for it. The next morning arrived cold and grey. The black car was idling by the front door, the driver silent. Richard and Helena walked out of the house side by side. Before getting into the car, he stopped and looked at her. "Whatever the return on this bet," he said, his voice firm, "it was the best investment I ever made." The hearing room was cold, impersonal, and painted a shade of beige that seemed to suck all the hope out of the air. On one side of the polished table, Dr. Shaw and Isabella looked perfectly at ease, flanked by a lawyer whose confidence was as expensive as his suit. On the other, Richard and Helena sat side by side, an alliance forged in silence and desperation. For Richard, the environment was strangely familiar. It felt like one of those board meetings where a company's fate is decided. But here, the asset at stake was the soul of his daughters, and he feared his balance sheet as a father was about to be declared insolvent. Isabella's lawyer spoke first, his voice a sharp instrument, portraying Richard as a well-intentioned but absent father, a billionaire more focused on his business deals and growing his fortune than on the emotional needs of his daughters. Helena was painted as an insubordinate and reckless employee whose sentimental actions jeopardized a $1 million investment in the children's health. The surgery was presented as the only logical and responsible course of action, the only guarantee of a future. When it was his turn, Richard pushed aside the notes his own lawyer had prepared. He stood up, not as the CEO accustomed to command, but as a man stripped of his certainties. He looked at the judge, a woman with graying hair and a shrewd gaze. "Your Honor," he began, his voice surprisingly steady, "my world is made of numbers. I understand interest rates, dividends, how to turn capital into more capital, and I treated my daughters the same way, as a problem to be solved with the best and most expensive resource. The truth is, I admit my fear. I don't know how to love without guaranteed returns." The courtroom was utterly silent. Helena, beside him, felt a wave of empathy so strong it almost left her breathless. When she was called, she stood, and her voice, though soft, echoed with the same brutal honesty. "I was afraid too," she confessed. "I was afraid of caring too much, of crossing the line between professional and personal, because I've lost a job over it before. I'm terrified of promising and losing again, but what I promised them wasn't sight, it was the world, and the world isn't a sterile, controlled place." The turning point, however, came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Peterson was called to testify. The housekeeper, who for years had been the personification of rules and order, walked to the stand with slow, guilty steps. Her voice breaking with tears, she confessed to hiding Beatrice's letters. "I thought I was protecting my employer, the order of the house," she sobbed, "but I was hiding their true inheritance. I buried their mother's voice out of shame and fear." She handed the yellowed envelopes to the bailiff, and the weight of that act of contrition changed the atmosphere in the room. To complete the picture, Richard's lawyer presented a petition signed by hundreds of townspeople, mobilized by the story of the summer fair. They asked for nothing, only offering to support the creation of an accessible community garden inspired by the girls. The entire town, suddenly, was part of their story. The judge read one of the letters in silence, her expression unreadable. Then she looked up, her gaze passing over each of them. "Medical decisions of this magnitude cannot be made under pressure or based on brand narratives," she said, her voice calm but full of authority. "Any surgical procedure will be postponed indefinitely until a team of independent specialists appointed by this court can conduct a full and unhurried evaluation of the children in their own environment." She paused, looking directly at Richard. "And until then, This court strongly recommends that the sensory plan be maintained and encouraged. The emotional well-being of Lara and Lily is, at this moment, the most valuable asset this court intends to protect. The gavel fell, sealing the decision. The immediate war had been won. Richard looked at Helena, and for the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem like a risk to be calculated, but a promise to be lived. The judge's decision wasn't an ending, but a beginning. The postponement of the surgery and the validation of the sensory map were a victory, but the real work of rebuilding was just starting. As they left the courthouse, Dr. Shaw, furious at the setback to his plans, formally withdrew from the case with cutting coolness. Isabella, seeing her takeover bid fail, gave Richard a look that mixed contempt with a genuine inability to understand why he had chosen sentimental chaos over profitable order. For Richard, their departure felt like shedding two toxic liabilities from his life's portfolio. He finally understood that the greatest risk wasn't failing with the surgery, but succeeding in turning his daughters into something they weren't, shaped by the ambitions of others. The drive home was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence, one of relief and reflection, not tension. As he passed through the mansion gates, Richard no longer saw a mausoleum, but a blank canvas. In the days that followed, he acted with the same speed and decisiveness he used to close his biggest deals, but the currency was now different. He called a meeting with his team of architects and landscapers. "I don't want a house anymore," he declared, to everyone's surprise. "I want an experience center. I want tactile paths in the garden, with braille plaques describing each plant. I want a kitchen adapted for children's cooking workshops. I want the music room to have a floor that vibrates with the notes from the piano." He picked up the phone and called the president of the state's leading association for the visually impaired. "I have an investment proposal," he said, using the language he knew for a purpose he had just discovered. "I want to turn my property into a pilot project for accessibility and inclusion. I want my daughter's inheritance to be not just the money I leave them, but the world we help build." To finance this radical transformation, he made a decision that shocked the financial markets. He sold a significant stake in his company, giving up a portion of the absolute control he had always prized. The acquired capital was not reinvested in the stock market or in crypto, but in the foundation that would bear his late wife's name, Beatrice. The mansion ceased to be a fortress and became a bridge. Local artisans were hired to install the textures and sounds, and the community garden, supported by the town, began to take shape on the adjacent land, connecting the mansion walls to the life of the community. Helena watched the transformation with a mixture of awe and joy. Richard called her for a conversation in his study, which now had its windows open, letting in the breeze and the sounds of the garden. "I can't do this without you," he said, "but not as a nanny. I want you to be the pedagogical director of the Beatrice Foundation. I want you to bring the soul to this project." Helena's heart soared. It was more than she had ever dreamed of. "I accept," she replied, "on one condition." He raised his eyebrows. "The house can't devour anyone's heart. We'll have hours, weekends, vacations, the girls and us. We need a life that is ours, not just the project's." Richard smiled, a genuine, tired smile. "That's the smartest clause I've ever heard." The closeness between them grew slowly, carefully, like learning to read a new language. He was learning to apologize and to wait. She was learning to trust without losing herself. There were no promises of a fairy tale romance, but the foundation of something real, built on the honesty of their own flaws, began to solidify. The war was over, and in place of the trenches, a garden was beginning to bloom. The last evening of the month arrived not with the fanfare of a conclusion, but with the serenity of a fulfilled promise. Time was no longer measured in productivity reports or the dollar's exchange rate, but in the cycle of the garden's flowers and the length of a song. From the town square, where the community garden already showed its first stubborn sprouts, came the sound of fiddles, a melody that intertwined with the smell of earth, damp from a brief late afternoon shower, a scent of new beginnings that the warm breeze carried into the house. The doors and windows, once always shut to protect a legacy of silence, were now open, inviting the world in. Richard crossed the living room, his steps no longer echoing in the void, but absorbed by the new tapestry of textures that guided the pathways. He stopped in front of the piano. The instrument that had for so long been the tomb of his happiest memories was now an invitation. He lifted the lid, and the gesture didn't have the weight of grief, but the lightness of acceptance. Lara and Lily, who were nearby, sensed the shift in the air's vibration, their father's silent intention. They approached without hurry, with the confidence of those who know the map of their own universe. They didn't sit beside him, but stood at the curve of the grand piano and laid their open palms on the dark, polished wood. This was how they listened now, not with their ears, but with their whole bodies, feeling the music born in their nerve endings. Helena drew near and leaned against the other side of the piano, close to the girls. A slight tremor ran through her, not of fear, but of an emotion so overwhelming it was almost unbearable. It was the vertigo of someone who has finally come home after a long and uncertain journey. Richard looked at them, his daughters, feeling the music before it even existed, and the woman who had taught them the language of the world, and he understood the nature of true wealth. The final revelation was simple, and for that very reason, devastating. The love the girls had been taught to feel for the things of the earth, for scents, sounds, and textures, had, in turn, taught the adults how to feel too. They were the teachers. He and Helena were the students. His fingers then touched the keys. The first chord wasn't hesitant like the last time, but clear, resonating through the room and through the wood, traveling directly into the hands of his daughters, who smiled in unison. The sound spread through the corridors, filling the spaces once occupied by pain and absence, and the house, which for so many years had held its breath, finally seemed to exhale a long, relieved sigh. Richard and Helena exchanged a look over the piano, a look that needed no words, that held the weight of all their battles, the cost of every tear, and the beauty of surrender. Romantic justice, the kind that doesn't arrive on a white horse, but in the quiet perseverance of affection, had finally come, and it had cost enough, in pride and in fear, to be worth every second of the wait, every note of that new and imperfect song.